Good morning, I'm Tris from the Garden System, and today I'm here to talk about the dangers of transmedicalism, Kalvin Garrah, and self-righteous bullying. Throughout this video, I will be using Kalvin Garrah as an example of transmedicalism, mostly because his views and his actions are quite well documented on YouTube itself. Most of this documentation started with Corviday's video, Kalvin Garrah, The Dangers of Transgender Bullying. Throughout this video, Corviday very clearly shows what Kalvin Garrah has done and how harmful it can be. Later on in 2020, Brennan, one of the targets of Kalvin Garrah's harassment, made a video breaking my silence on Kalvin Garrah. If you watch any of the videos I recommend, it has to be this one, because getting to hear the actual damage done by Kalvin Garrah from his direct targets is probably the most important information to understand the harm done. I will never be able to articulate the damage being done as well as Brennan can. The third video I highly recommend people check out is a video by Cops Hate Mo, in which Mo, it's titled Kalvin Garrah is far worse than you thought, and in this video Mo goes over everything Kalvin Garrah has done and how it has harmed people, as well as offering the stories of some of the targets who didn't have the means to tell it themselves or didn't want to open themselves up to it. Please check these videos out, in large part because I don't think I can go into the direct cases as well as they can. I don't think I can articulate as well as they have how it has hurt people. And also, I don't want to go in depth too much here because I want to avoid making this video too triggering. Do keep in mind the videos I've mentioned have trigger warnings. Carefully read them through before watching them. Thank you. Part 1. What is transmedicalism? Transmedicalism, very simply put, is the viewpoint that people, some trans, some cis, hold that only people who seek a complete and full medical transition, meaning taking hormones and getting surgery, count as really trans. They will often say that people who don't completely fully medically want to transition don't really count as trans and are doing it because it's a trend. Now, the first kind of noticeable thing is that this kind of relies on a falsehood. Being trans is not very popular. It's not going to make you a lot of friends. It might get you into some support groups, but at the same time, those support groups will probably figure out eventually if you don't actually talk about trans issues and are just there for yourself. There might be some young people sometimes who don't completely understand what being trans is, but the point there is educating them on what it really is by openly talking about it. And if we openly talk about what being trans is and being trans means, you won't really have people who fake it eventually, because we will be able to tell when it's done maliciously and when it's done because people don't properly understand. We just make them understand. It's not that hard. But where the real harm comes in is that transmedicalism isn't really about whether or not people medically transition. It's about defining what a real transgender person is in order to create a value judgment. The real trans people, in a transmedicalist view, are better and more deserving than the not really trans people. This also results in a shifting goalpost of what really does and does not count as really trans, where the definition isn't actually based on how much you have a need for this, how much dysphoria you have, how much you have a need to take hormones, but it tends to fall down into how you present your gender and how you're trans. What this will result in is a certain specific targets of transmedicalist bullying. These targets will often be non-binary, since a non-binary person can't fit in a binary, either you get full surgery or you don't viewpoint, or people who are neurodivergent, people who don't exactly fit within the standard behavior of people. And with the goalposts suddenly shifting, you end up with people doing things that don't really matter, and it just enforces gender binaries. Trans men, for example, might be told they shouldn't be putting on makeup because it's girly, when really there is no reason why any man shouldn't have to wear makeup. If a man, cis, trans, or otherwise, wants to put on makeup, it doesn't matter. And if a woman wants to say, I don't want to wear makeup, that's totally fine. And the same goes for non-binary people. They get to choose for themselves. So what really ends up happening with this is that they are just picking a target in order to push them down and lift themselves up. Usually this ends up being minors, or neurodivergent people, or non-binary people. People who already don't have that much support, especially in online spaces, and tend to be quite easy targets. Usually this tends to come from people not really listening to non-binary voices as much as the voices of binary trans people. This will kind of result in non-binary seeming a bit strange or odd to people who haven't encountered it before. And in the case of neurodivergent people, they often behave in ways that don't fit the neurotypical standards they are told to strive towards, and are thus seen as childish or immature, and therefore not taken seriously when they speak about their issues. And for minors, do I have to explain why we shouldn't be bullying minors online who often still need to develop their ability to handle with these kind of things? I hope not, at least. Part 2. Who is Kalvin? Kalvin is, by now, I think, a former YouTuber. Kalvin has been kind of bleeding subscribers ever since the backlash against him started, which mostly kind of started with Corviday's video, where the discussion around him started shifting. Before Corviday's video, anyone speaking out against Kalvin would often get just completely hate-bombed by Kalvin's fans, but Corviday kind of showed a shifting in the tide. People started to see that Kalvin was really harmful, and when Brennan spoke up publicly on YouTube, it really opened the floodgate to people realizing just how horrible Kalvin is. Ever since, there have been increasingly more videos made by various different YouTubers speaking about why they dislike Kalvin or don't support him anymore. Over the time, it has become more accepting to hate him, and Kalvin has been bleeding subscribers, sticking mostly to his Patreon and TikTok, but it seems after the last really big video made on him by Cops Hate Mo and some quite heavy backlash against him on Twitter that he mentioned leaving YouTube. Now, him leaving YouTube actually kind of shows a big issue I have with him. Earlier in the year, he said he deleted his video on Brennan, which was a good sign. And then, now, he just unprivated it, showing he never deleted it, he just privated it so nobody would see it, and now that he's getting backlash and is leaving, he put it back up to, according to him, say his side of the story. When he isn't saying anything, he's just bullying a person. It very clearly to me shows a lack of responsibility. He does not care if his actions hurt others. He's there for himself. He doesn't care if him spreading a transmedicalist viewpoint will result in the bullying and harassment of other trans people. Because yes, a lot of the people that he claims are transgenders are actually trans. Because, well, we can ask them and they will say they are trans. That's the only justification you need. One of the more horrifying examples talked about in the videos I listed before is that Kalvin didn't seem to really care when his actions severely threatened a person he talked about. I won't go into the details because I know it can be very triggering, and in case you couldn't watch the videos with how triggering they are, or if you want an escape from just how bad it is, I'm not gonna go into details, but it really shows the harm he has done, and he never cared, only showing how he wasn't responsible or wasn't at fault, not really thinking about how he did something and it had consequences. He didn't care. I also want to point out how he often labels his harassment as just opinions or just his side of the story, when that usually isn't the case. When he is attacking minors with smaller platforms than him, there is a consequence. You see, I, at time of recording, have a very tiny platform. I have like 10 subscribers, so even if I told people to go hate on Kalvin Garrah, it wouldn't do much. It would be maybe 2 or 3 tweets that people would send out because of me. But Kalvin, with a very large subscriber base, can have hundreds and thousands of people attacking anyone he points his finger at. And I think that's very harmful. And if he just plays it off as facts or opinions and he has no part in what his fan base does, he's showing he doesn't care about responsibility. And that makes him dangerous. Because we can't prove he harms people. There is nothing that can be done to make him stop except not giving him the chance. He won't stop unless he has no other choice. Part 3. How Transmedicalism affects those who believe in it. In this part, I want to look at how trans people might end up falling in the trap of Transmedicalism, the same way Kalvin Garrah did. I think usually this starts off somewhat innocently. I think for the most part, people like Kalvin Garrah just want to transition. They, through their own dysphoria, feel a lot of insecurities and doubts about their own body, and they push back against them by transitioning, essentially. So in their mind, transitioning has a very strict and clear path, identifying the traits that belong to the gender assigned at birth they don't like, and moving those traits over to more resemble the traits seen in the gender they're trying to transition into. Simply put, they have the way they don't want to look and the way they want to look more, and that's the transition journey, and that's where you're going into. But when you then see another person who is also trans but doesn't have a similar journey, it can get a little bit confusing. You see, it's very easy for transmedicalists to see someone who's going the opposite direction and still understand, because in many ways, the reason why you're taking the journey and the reason it goes the way you want is the same reason: the experience of gender dysphoria to a certain level of strength. But when you see a trans person who only wants to transition part of the way, whose transition goals maybe don't include the same things you do, for example, how some trans people might not want to take surgeries, or maybe don't want to change anything about their voice, or see side effects in hormones that make them decide maybe I want to try transitioning without hormones, or maybe take up more social and beauty standard roles that they do not want. Within the more extreme views of a transmedicalist, these different transition journeys and transition goals are very difficult to really rationalize and understand. In truth, it's very simple. People experience dysphoria differently and in different levels, so some people have different goals in their transition or only feel dysphoria around certain parts of themselves and are fine with other parts and choose to go the less invasive routes of keeping the parts they're fine with just as they are. To transmedicalists, this is difficult and scary because they have made a definition of being trans that requires, as they see it, a complete and full transition, whereas anyone who doesn't have the same transition goal as them, in their eyes, is doing a partial transition. So in their eyes, they're not fully transitioning, so they're not fully or really trans. What this ends up resulting in is these people try and lift their own views up, their own idea of themselves, by defining themselves as above these not really trans people they see. When in truth, they are trans. Anybody who wants to transition is trans. It doesn't have to be completely going into surgery. You don't always need to take hormones. You don't need to take on every gender social role that is put upon you. But to a transmedicalist, this is all part of it. And by making this latter, because they look more to the cis-normative ideal that they hold, they can define themselves as better. And this means, because they are superior to other people in their own eyes, they have a justification for harassing and bullying those below them, because they're no longer really trans, and they no longer deserve the sympathy or respect they would show another trans person. And this tends to get further and further, because eventually you completely dehumanize them and just don't show sympathy anymore. Eventually, a transmedicalist will see someone with a different transition goal, declare them a transgender, and say that any harm done upon them is completely fine. And here is where we start getting into the real damage they do. Part 4. How to escape transmedicalism. At the beginning of this, I kind of told a lie. This video isn't really about Kalvin Garrah, so why did I still think it was important that people know about what he did? Because he is a very public transmedicalist. What he does to hurt people is very easy to see and very clear. He dehumanizes people to the point that he will actively see a video by a trans person, see what their preferred pronouns are, and actively refuse to use them, and instead constantly misgender them throughout the entire video. We know he's a piece of shit. We know that he, in the end, is only there to hurt people. So, why is this video not about him? Because there are many people who share his views, many people on internet forums, his own fans, who think what he does is right and do it themselves. We know some of the people who Kalvin Garrah made videos on, but how much do we know about the many people who talk about their experience with gender online, who have other transmedicalists suddenly barge into their comments, barge into their mentions, and just constantly harass them and hate on them for not being trans the right way? This hurts people a lot. I think an important way in how we fight transmedicalism and people using transmedicalism to harass and hurt other people is actually quite simple. What we really need to do is change our public discourse and discussion around gender to not really allow transmedicalist viewpoints in it. We need to more actively listen to all kinds of trans people, which includes non-binary people, but also, yes, binary trans people, and how they might not completely want to do a full transition, in air quotes, in the transmedicalist way. They might still say, yes, I'm a binary trans person, but I'm not going to have this surgery, or I don't want to take these gender norms on myself. For example, some trans women don't want to wear makeup. Does that not make them a woman? Does that mean any woman who doesn't wear makeup is automatically a man? Are we going to apply this to cis women? Another important thing for us to recognize is how complex and varied non-binary identities really are. There is often a misconception online that non-binary people are kind of these very androgynous, wide-looking, flat-chested, middle-length, short-length hair people, when in truth, non-binary people can look a massive variety of ways. There is no definition of what a non-binary person looks like, and especially how the standard for most non-binary people is white is also important, because how often does the trans community online really listen to people of color who are trans? Because it's kind of an issue at times, how I'm feeding into this issue because I'm white myself. What's also important to understand is that we keep seeing the humanity in others that we talk about. These trans people that Kalvin thinks are fine to bully, that his fans think is fine to harass, and completely brigade with hate in their comments, are still people. They have emotions, they have feelings. It matters how we talk to them, and we should treat them as people. We should treat them fairly and openly, like we would any other. I think another very important thing is that we need to make it standard that we, as trans people, define ourselves as individuals by our own standards and not that of others, especially not the standards of cis people, because cis people don't know shit about gender. How can we let them define how we should look like? I hope with this that we can kind of stop making transmedicalism as common. It kind of seems to be on a decline since more people are speaking up about it, but it's come too late. There has been a lot of harm done by transmedicalism already, and we really need to take a vocal stand against it, especially the uplifting of trans people whose voices are often suppressed. The neurodivergent trans people, non-binary trans people, and especially trans people of color. So, to wrap everything up at the end, transmedicalism has done a lot of harm, and Kalvin Garrah is a very good example of how this is being done, especially in online spaces. There is also other harm that I don't think I'm the best person to talk about, but is also important, like how transmedicalism is often medically enforced, or how it's sometimes seen as the default within the medical system itself. These are also still important conversations, but what I'm personally most interested in is how can we move the cultural perception ourselves. I think by centering non-binary people, trans people of color, and other trans people who don't exactly fit into a transmedicalist worldview, and allowing their voices to be heard, uplifting them when we can, and in this way showing that these people's experiences are normal, accepted, and we should recognize them. I also want to repeat that if you haven't yet, the videos I talked about earlier and linked below I think are very important to understand this concept. I also want to urge you to follow these people on social media platforms, since that they tend to talk more about this developing situation. I'm not that interested in going after Kalvin Garrah myself in this video, because he is being held accountable by these videos and the people talking about them. So that's why I think the best way to hold him accountable is by directing people towards what is going on and to try and uplift the voices, especially of people like Brennan, trying to speak up about what is going on. Aside from that, I want to do some quick calls to actions on this. The last video was a bit too serious for me to be willing to put them on, but since I'm a very small, growing, struggling YouTuber, I want to ask you to please share this video around, and if you enjoy it, leave a like, and please comment any feedback you have. It really is very appreciated, and I can definitely use the feedback. If you enjoy it, subscribe. I'm hoping to put out more like this, especially things focused on disability, because there are things very similar to transmedicalism happening in disabled communities that I think we maybe need to also talk about. If I manage to find the words together, that might become a future video, or I might focus on something else. A lot of my videos have been based on whatever I'm seeing online at the moment, and eventually just being so overwhelmed by the situation that I feel a need to make a video as a form of venting my own emotions on it. So, with all that said, I genuinely hope you enjoyed, and I'm wishing everyone a really good day.